welcome to Reportage. This is Danish Benabi. In today's segment of Reportage, I have with me Mr. Professor Surinder S. Jodhka, who has come up with a wonderful book on the concept of village in India, its inception and the contribution in the nation building. The book is titled "In the Indian Village, Rural Lives in the 21st Century," which has been published by the Aleph Books. Explain to the viewers rather how actually the British exploited the village to set their agenda of divide and rule.
Thank you very much for having me on this program. We are talking about this book, I suppose, isn't it?
Right.
Yes, this is a book on the Indian village. It's called The Indian Village, Rural Lives in the 21st Century, where I talk about how our notion of village has, in some sense, evolved over the past, particularly past 200 years. And that is the notion which has now become part of the common sense through which we comprehend things like village and city. So in that context, in the opening chapter, I do talk about how a particular view of village has come to dominate our imagination. And this, in some sense, was crafted by the British colonial rulers. And this was crafted not simply as an empirical category, but also as a construct in the sense that it meant something specific which gave legitimacy to the British colonization of India. When British came to India, this was not a region which was kind of, as we understand today, underdeveloped or backward compared to their own societies. In some sense, they came here because this was land of riches and many people from Europe wanted to come here. So having come here, they also, in some sense, developed ambitions of ruling over this region. But this was also the time when British society was undergoing profound changes. And it is in that context that they developed theories of Indian society, the kind of place India is. And these are not simply description. These are not simply descriptive accounts of rural life or Indian society or the region or the kind of economy and society that existed here. They were also intended to kind of make a point which would legitimize their presence here. Some of the viewers might have heard about Kipling's famous poem called White Man's Burden, where he talks about how it's historic responsibility of the white man to civilize rest of the world. Now, India was not a primitive place. India was not, in that sense, quote unquote, uncivilized. No place is uncivilized, but that's how the new language was being invented. So this is also the time when Europe is, in some sense, trying to control the world, and it is not simply a kind of political power or not simply a question of plunder of economic resources at various places from various places. It's also a kind of moment when Europe wants to establish its hegemony over the rest of the world and tell the world that we are, in some sense, the place to look up to. And it is in that context that the idea of village emerges in this kind of narrative, where village is seen as site of backwardness, a place which does not change, it's kind of static, it's an internally kind of homogeneous. And India is a land of villages. So there are innumerable villages, and each village has been the way it is for centuries, and it cannot change on its own unless the external rulers come and, in some sense, destroy its equilibrium.
Professor Surinder, explain this to me. After 1947, how basically the villages have contributed in India's nation building?
These are very different questions. I mean, India's nation building, villages contributed. I mean, I don't deal with this question in my book because villages are settlements. I mean, there are nearly 6 lakh villages in India. So they don't contribute in that sense. They are part of this land. And you can think about green revolution if you want to talk about contribution. But that is of different people. I mean, agriculture is not the only thing that villagers do. So in some sense, I try to argue against this notion of village being a homogeneous kind of entity.
But you do explain, you do mention in your book about the interdependence of village on a city and city on a village. How is a city more dependent on a village? Explain this to the viewers.
See, city and village are not separate entities. So every region has urban settlements. It also has rural settlements, and they are part of the same social formation, right? So it has never been the case that cities are some different kind of entity and villages are different kind of entity. It's because of the villages, because of settled agriculture, that cities become possible. They co-evolve. It's not like city comes only with modernization and industry, and villages have existed already. So villages and cities have evolved together. So they are integrated anyway as part of the settlements or regional social life, political economies. So they have never been separate. Yes, there are varieties of settlements. There are cities, there are towns, there are smaller towns. Likewise, there are also varieties of villages. But these settlements are interconnected. Every region had its own kind of social formations where you have villages as well as cities, and you have smaller towns. You have various kinds of diversities, even in the urban landscape. So people always, in some sense, went in and out of villages. I mean, urban areas had elites, and elites were able to sustain themselves by exploiting the rural residents. I mean, agriculture provided land revenue, and that's how riches were built. I mean, Taj Mahal was not built by Shah Jahan from his own wealth. It was taken away from the common peasants and people who were working in fields, and it was their income which was kind of taxed, and that's how they built their riches.
For me, chapter 3rd of this book makes a wonderful read, where you talk about the founding fathers of India, Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar. And all the three had three different views regarding the villages. Let's take all the three of them and let's start with Gandhi. You say that Gandhi's explanation was that India lived in its villages. Explain this theory of M.K. Gandhi for the viewers.
Gandhi, all of them were actually very urban. Gandhi always, his family had always been a kind of urban family. They were not from village, and Gandhi had no idea about villages, Indian villages. It was only in South Africa, when he goes to Britain, when he learns about India from the colonial writings, that he begins to, in some sense, develop an opinion or vision of India. And then obviously he's introduced to various kind of challenges. It's a very peculiar kind of situation in South Africa when he begins to talk about how India is a land of villages, and villages are republics, and therefore they are already civilized and advanced. So he doesn't mention cities that he was familiar with or where he was born. But then he develops a kind of critique of colonial rule over India by invoking the idea of village. And for him, village is not simply a settlement. It is also, in some sense, an alternative to Western style modern life, which according to him could be lived only in cities. And for him, then cities begin to signify Western modernity. And Western modernity, in some sense, for him was immoral. And villages, which actually the Britishers described India as land of villages. They were there already, but they were also integrated in the cities, and cities were also Indians. So he picks up this idea of village as a kind of utopia, as a kind of imaginary place where you could have a happier and a more balanced kind of life, where people are not greedy, where people are not fighting with each other, where people are not, in some sense, all the time desperate for consumption. So all those things he kind of imagines. But these were European ideas of utopian life. He had no familiarity with the actual village life, which was marked by untouchability, which was divided on caste lines. And actually, when he comes to India and starts traveling around and goes to villages, he's very disappointed. He sees villages as filthy, where people are kind of, in some sense, he's aghast by the kind of untouchability that he encounters, practice of untouchability in rural life. So then he is also disappointed. But at the same time, he continues to talk about village. And he also wanted to foreground the idea of village because most of the nationalist leaders of his contemporaries, they all came from cities, and they did not think of the large, 90% of rural masses. And in some sense, he tried to remind them that you don't think only about yourself, or don't think only about your class. Also think about rural settlements. And then he comes up with a kind of uh, plan how to reform villages, how to kind of actually have villages of his imagination, the utopian India. So for him, village was not simply a demographic space, it was not simply a traditional society, it was also, in some sense, a kind of recovery of the self. And that's how he kind of coined his idea of Swaraj.
Professor Surinder, what we call the antithesis was Mr. Ambedkar to the Gandhi. On the other hand, Ambedkar saw all the ills in the village. There was a fundamental difference between the two theorists. Gandhi on the one hand, Ambedkar on the other. Why was Ambedkar against the village idea?
Yeah, I mean, that's also kind of well known. Ambedkar was not really providing an antithesis of Gandhi. Ambedkar, in some sense, also is, in some sense, influenced by the colonial view of the village. But he is also obviously more empirically grounded, in the sense that he has seen untouchability, and he had kind of closer ties with the rural life, much closer than Gandhi had. And he obviously talks about his people, right? When you talk about Dalits and you go to any village in India, anywhere, you would see a locality which is away from the village. And this is the locality of what we called as untouchable caste groups. And these untouchable caste groups had no space in that notion of India. So Ambedkar was not simply talking about village, he was also trying to develop a critique of Gandhian, in some sense, view of India, or a view of future of India, or post-colonial independent India, where untouchables need to be integrated as citizens. And in the prevailing structure, prevailing imagination of life, untouchable had no space. If you were to just revive the village, that would completely throw them out. They are not part of India. How would they become part of India? So he develops a critique of village, and he says that the best place to see caste oppression is the village. The village is a kind of working plant of caste oppression. For him, caste is not simply a cultural reality like for Gandhi it is. Gandhi thinks that caste system is all right. It has evolved in our history as a civilisational kind of structure, and why should we run away from it? Untouchability is a bad thing. While for Ambedkar, there is no separation between untouchability and caste system, and for him it is an oppressive system. For him, caste is not simply a matter of traditional culture. He sees it as a lived reality for people of his caste and his community, and they are experiencing violence of untouchability. For him, it is violence. It's not simply a cultural kind of decline. It is a structural feature of what he called as the Hindu society. So Ambedkar, in some sense, was obviously completely in disagreement with Gandhi as far as thinking about village as unit of Indian democracy was concerned. And this came up in the Constituent Assembly, where Gandhian idea of village was not really accepted, and Ambedkar had a point, and then obviously we all know what happened later.
And Professor Surinder, between these two ends was more liberal, more outward, more modern Mr. Nehru. Where did Nehru fit in these two poles between Ambedkar and between Gandhi?
So they're all modern. Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar. Gandhi is also very modern. When he's talking about village, he's not talking about village as going back to the past. He also wants to evolve a new kind of village. Ambedkar is actually more modern than Nehru, because Ambedkar is also talking about democratic politics and restructuring of Indian life as a nation state of individual citizens. Yes, Nehru is influenced by the left-wing imaginations of India, so he invokes the idea of peasantry. Nehru is at some level very much like Gandhi. He is also an urban person. His family comes from Srinagar. They live in Delhi. From there, they go to Allahabad, and he's born in this urban elite family, and then he goes to study abroad. So he has no idea about village life, and he develops this idea of freedom struggle, not out of, in some sense, a personal compulsion, but as a kind of influenced by the Western idea of democracy. So, and then when he also, in his own words, goes out and tries to discover India, and he goes to villages, and then he sees that there are people are divided. They're the landlords and they're peasants, and poor peasants are struggling. They die, they don't protest, and those kinds of things. So he brings in, at some level, a very kind of modernization theory kind of notion of village, where village are seen as sites of backwardness. For Ambedkar, village is a site of oppression. For Gandhi, village is a site of authenticity. For Nehru, village is a site of backwardness. And he thinks that, cities are modern, cities are places where individuality is possible, while villages, because of their composition, because of their being traditional. So in some sense, all of them are talking through the language of Western modernity. So this whole idea of backwardness is also a notion of Western modernity, where you begin to see village as a site where collective communities live, or you have kind of in Marxist category, peasant societies and landlords live. So which is not far from reality, but at the same time, Nehru, for example, rarely talks about caste. He does not see inequalities in terms of the segregations in terms of caste. So he, in some sense, mostly uses the word class and peasants and landlords and their struggles, and obviously then agrarian societies being exploited by the British and stuff like that.
Towards the end of the book, you say that the village life lives on and it will never die. Explain this to the viewers. What draws you to this conclusion?
I mean, village lives on. It's a kind of notion that middle class Indians have, that we are all on the way to becoming urban, right? So this again is a kind of fictitious notion of thinking of settlements in binary terms, that there was one kind of society and now there is another kind of society, or there were rural communities and now there is urban society. So, and that's how everyone evolves. So it has happened to some extent in the Western context, where most of the, in some sense, people are now living in what are now called as urban centers. But this classification, according to me, itself is flawed. So settlements are not to be divided into rural and urban. Settlements are always evolving. They're always changing. There are varieties of settlements. This is only a language. These are categories which we use. And this is the kind of category which is used by the establishment and the urban middle classes to, at some level, establish their own hegemonic power over the kind of larger nation-state society. So villages are seen as being incapable of having ideas about themselves. So they have to be ruled from outside. We saw the way farm laws were passed in 2019-20, where farmers were not even consulted, and it was assumed that people sitting in Niti Aayog know what is good for agriculture and what is best for people living in villages. So that is the point I'm trying to contest in the concluding chapter, that we urban Indians have a notion of village which is our own notion of ourselves, and we think that we are very superior, we are educated, and people living there, they are backward, they are traditional, they are not educated, they don't know anything about the world, which is a complete untrue kind of imagination. In some sense, urban residents are likely to be less aware of the world than a rural farmer or a poor person who has to struggle and look around what can be the best way to find way out. I'm not essentializing villages as being places of wisdom, but at the same time, there is no single type of village. There are different kinds of rural settlements. There are different kinds of settlements which are called as urban. This is only a matter of classification. People we call as rural, they are very diverse. They have a notion of themselves, and they sometimes have no choice, and therefore they stay back in villages. But very often they have choices, and they still choose to live in villages. And these are kind of lifestyles that they in some sense still find viable. We saw during pandemic how people who were living in urban areas, they had no other way but to kind of go back to their villages. They walked hundreds of kilometers, in some cases more than 1,000 kilometers, to go back to their village, because that was the place where their families were. That's the place where the home was. And this is not something that one can, in some sense, ignore. Likewise, when farmers were sitting on the borders of Delhi through the months of winter and summer and rain, they were doing it for some reason. It's not like they are stupid people and they have no understanding. So they take their own locations and their lives and their livelihoods very seriously, like everyone else does. Like workers go on strike, or officers would go on kind of protest that we need old pension scheme, not new pension scheme. Likewise, people living in villages also have their notion of what is good for them. And their notions may not be to our liking for people living in urban areas, but we have no right to pass judgment on their way of being and their. So that is what this book is trying to, in some sense, invite people to.
And village life will live on.
Pardon?
And the village life will live on.
No, I'm not saying that village life will live on. There is nothing called the village life. There are villages, and in villages also you'll find a large variety of lifestyles. I mean, you go to a village of Punjab or Kerala, there's nothing called village life. I mean, those lives have changed quite a lot. So we have a notion of village life, which again comes from our own static view of urban life, like as if there is urban life. In urban life also, there are people living in slums, there are people living in houses which cost like more than 100 crore rupees. So there are different kinds of lifestyles in cities. So likewise, villages also, there are poor villages, there are rich villages, there are villages who are very mobile, there are villagers who work in cities and go and live in the village. So there is no single one village life. Village was never isolated. So that notion itself is something that I try to contest in this book.
Professor Surinder, thank you very much for talking to me. A wonderful book indeed. And I think and I hope that all the students, especially the agriculturists, will look at this book. The academics will look at this book and have a read, go through this book. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this discussion.
Please subscribe to our channel Reportage and press the bell icon to remain updated.